Clint Eastwood is responsible for two of the best supernatural westerns of all time, in High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider, a pair of films that were released over a decade apart, yet share so much in common that many have wondered, are they actually connected? Well, my name is Mark, and in this video I'm going to explain the real reason why they're so alike, whether or not they're actually connected, and what Clint Eastwood himself has to say about all the speculation. So let's start at the beginning with High Plains Drifter, a 1973 western that was directed by and starred Clint Eastwood. Now at this point in his career, Eastwood had already made a name for himself in the western genre thanks to his role as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, and off the back of its success, he appeared in multiple other western movies. But High Plains Drifter was the first time that Eastwood starred in a western that he actually directed himself. And rather than playing it safe by making a traditional, fan-pleasing western, Eastwood opted to create something far more ambitious, darker, and surreal. So in the movie, Clint Eastwood plays a mysterious gunslinger known only as the Stranger, who rides into the small mining town of Lego shortly after their marshal has been whipped to death by a group of outlaws, in front of the whole community, who were too cowardly to intervene. So the locals are understandably terrified, leading them to hire the nameless drifter to protect them from the outlaws, who are expected to soon return. And without ever revealing his name or true agenda, the Stranger agrees and trains the town for the impending conflict, while also manipulating and terrorizing them in order to expose their guilt and culpability and allowing their marshal to be killed without ever trying to help. And when it comes to their big showdown with the returning outlaws, the Stranger suddenly leaves them to fend for themselves, as if to punish them further, before finally appearing at the last minute to brutally dispatch the killers for their crimes, only to leave just as mysteriously as he arrived, without ever making his true motivations known. So this of course leaves us with the big lingering question of who was the Stranger, because it's heavily implied throughout the movie that he might actually have a supernatural origin, and even seems to disappear on the horizon in the final scene. Now I have explained this ending in much more detail in a separate video, but long story short, Clint Eastwood has since clarified his interpretation of it in a rare interview, saying,
"As it was written, you knew it was the guy who comes back was the brother of the murdered sheriff." That was the thing, but I'd made it very ambiguous so the audience could draw in their own conclusions to it. Was this some sort of mythical deal? Was this some sort of apparition?
Alongside this, in his biography, despite admitting that he initially believed he was portraying the brother of the murdered marshal, he later said, "I thought about playing it a little bit like he was a sort of avenging angel too." So essentially, this confirms that initially the Stranger was meant to just be a mortal man seeking revenge for the murder of his brother. However, at some point during production, Eastwood realized that there was an opportunity to really experiment with the genre and do something that hadn't really been done before in a western. So he deliberately injected biblical and supernatural themes into the story, and purposefully made the identity of the Stranger much more of a mystery. And in the end, this proved to be the right call, because not only was the film a commercial success, but it made what could have been a fairly predictable western completely unique, lending it a sense of intrigue that has kept the film relevant decades on from its release. So following this success, Clint Eastwood went on to star in and direct a wide range of movies, actively refining his craft as a filmmaker. But aside from the outlaw Josie Wales, he largely stepped away from the western genre, especially as it began to fall out of favour throughout the late 70s and early 80s. However, Eastwood eventually became determined to bring it back, and he believed that if he could create a western with a modern edge that successfully defied expectations, then people would once again be drawn to the genre. So with that in mind, he commissioned a script to be written for a unique western that would ultimately become known as Pale Rider. And in the film, Clint Eastwood plays a mysterious figure known only as the Preacher, who arrives in a small mining camp that's being terrorized by a ruthless land baron. So the terrified miners turn to him for help, as it becomes increasingly clear that he's no ordinary man, displaying an almost supernatural level of skill and resilience, effortlessly taking down anyone who opposes him. And once the corrupt forces have been dealt with and the miners are safe, the Preacher leaves just as mysteriously as he arrived, without ever revealing his true identity. So once again, we're left to wonder who was he? Because much like the stranger, it's strongly implied that the preacher is not strictly human, but rather some kind of ghostly or divine figure that appears to have been summoned to the aid of the miners by the prayer of a young girl. Now despite this, it's entirely possible to watch Pale Rider without even noticing the supernatural elements. And again, Clint Eastwood opted to leave the story open-ended, so that audiences could make up their own mind on how to interpret it. But when pushed on who Clint Eastwood believes the preacher to be, in an interview he said,
"He's a reincarnation of a preacher who was killed by the force of evil, the marshal in the story."
So this essentially confirms that the character of the preacher was intended to be some sort of ghostly presence, much like the Drifter, reinforcing the idea that Pale Rider was treading similar ground to High Plains Drifter. And now that we've looked at each film individually, we can start to see the overall similarities between the two movies much more clearly. For starters, both movies center around a mysterious unnamed outsider who rides into a troubled community being oppressed by dangerous outside forces. And in their desperation, they turn to the stranger for help, given that these mysterious riders are near-silent, highly skilled gunmen with an almost supernatural aura surrounding them. Their stories even share an almost identical structure, arriving out of nowhere, restoring balance through violence, and then disappearing without a trace. On top of that, both films heavily explore themes of justice, morality, and retribution, with strong biblical undertones. Most notably of all, both films begin and end in almost exactly the same way, with Eastwood's character emerging from the wilderness and then returning to it, never to be seen again. So considering this overwhelming amount of similarities, are the two movies actually officially connected? Well, the answer is somewhat complicated, because technically the answer is no, given that canonically they're standalone films featuring different characters and completely separate stories. However, when Clint Eastwood was preparing to direct Pale Rider, he admitted in his biography that he wanted to revisit the supernatural themes that he'd explored in High Plains Drifter. So when he went about commissioning the script for Pale Rider, he could have easily opted to make it a sequel to High Plains Drifter, especially given how much of a hit it was. But for whatever reason, be it artistic or commercial, Eastwood decided against creating that formal link. And personally, I believe the reason for this decision was because thanks to the influence of director Sergio Leone, Eastwood knew of a way he could connect the two films without explicitly doing so. You see, in the Dollars trilogy, despite having different nicknames across all three films, for all intents and purposes, Clint Eastwood played the same character known as the Man with No Name, who acted and dressed the same throughout all three movies, hence it being considered a trilogy. But when you watch the films together, you'll find they're full of discrepancies over timelines, motivations, and most notably, the same actors playing different roles in each film, in some cases even turning heroes into villains. And by taking this approach, Sergio Leone was able to build a franchise and reap all of the benefits that came with it, while also retaining his creative freedom to make each of the films unique and a piece of art in their own right. So it's my belief, based on the sheer amount of similarities, that Clint Eastwood decided to take a similar approach with High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider. Because given how meticulously crafted the stories in each of these films proved to be, there's simply no way that a director who had full creative control over both projects is going to be unaware of how strikingly similar they are, from their structure to their themes, and most importantly, their identical openings and endings, which would have been a conscious creative decision on Eastwood's part, and might well have been his subtle way of inviting the audience to make that connection. Because when viewed together, the two films really do feel like different sides of the same coin, representing two opposite interpretations of divine justice, played out across the same story. For example, in High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood plays a vengeful, almost demonic character who is eager to deliver justice through violence and destruction, while in Pale Rider, Clint Eastwood plays a peaceful, almost angelic character who is reluctant to resort to violence but will do so to protect the innocent from evil. So while the two films may not be officially connected, I do think there's a great deal of evidence that suggests Clint Eastwood did intend for them to be spiritual sequels, but given that the two films were released 12 years apart, apart and by different studios, it probably wasn't very practical or beneficial for them to be paired together in any meaningful way. Now, of course, this is all just speculation on my part, and you could just as easily argue that they're not connected at all. But either way, I think the fact that this discussion is possible just goes to show how intelligent of a filmmaker Clint Eastwood really was, because he gave the audience all the clues they needed in both films to solve their big mysteries, but left it to them to decide on how to put them together, or whether to ignore them completely and simply enjoy the film at face value. So in that regard, when it comes to the question of whether High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider are connected, the answer is entirely up to you. But out of interest, let me know below, had you ever considered the two films to be connected? And while you're here, you might also want to check out this video right here.